Okay, hello everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you are. Welcome to the SOGCA Conference Session 19 on religion. I am Vitor Lopes Andrade, a PhD student at the University of Sussex and chair of the session. Thanks to Mohammed for being our facilitator. So he's working behind the scenes to guarantee that everything goes well. And before we start this session that has 3 presentations, I just need to provide you with some practical information. So the presentations will be recorded and later posted online, but the Q&A, the questions and answers part will not. Because of the number of participants and in the interests of confidentiality, we are unfortunately not able to open the session up to oral questions. However, you can type your questions and comments using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and I will select as many questions as there is time for to discuss after the 2 presentations. You can send your questions during the talks. You don't need to wait until the 3 presenters have spoken. And please write to which participant your question is for, or if it is for all of them. As I said before, we have 2 presentations and each one has 15 minutes. So I will let the speakers know when they have used 12 minutes, so they know that they still have like 3 more minutes to finish. And you can find information about the speakers, like their biographies and abstracts, on the conference page of the SOGCA website. So just before giving the floor to our speakers, I'd like to highlight the importance of this session specifically. Because when we look at the Soldiers Island studies as a field, as an area of knowledge, most research has a legal perspective. And therefore, social aspects are usually not included. However, religion may play a very important role in different stages of asylum claimants and refugees' lived experiences. It's important to know, important to mention, for instance, that religion was mentioned by our first and our second keynote speakers, and also mentioned in different panels during this conference. Many times, asylum claimants are fleeing not only their state, their society, family, but also religious institutions in their countries of origin. And once they arrive in the country of destination, the decision makers may use religion against their claims. So questions such as, how is that possible that you are Christian and gay? Or how is it possible that you are lesbian and Muslim are very common in many countries. But at the same time, there are support groups for asylum claimants and refugees that are religious. So it's really important to pay attention to the intersection between religion, the asylum process, and social interaction. And this panel is somehow then filling this gap in the Soldiers Island studies. We'll have 2 presentations focusing on the UK and 1 presentation focusing on Germany. And so now I would like to pass the floor to Dr. Moira Dustin, who is our first speaker, and her presentation is entitled Religion and NGO Support in the UK. Moira, please.
Thank you very much, Vitor, and thank you for that introduction in particular, which I think got to the heart of some of the issues that, pardon me, that I'm going to talk about and that we're all going to talk about. And I was going to do a PowerPoint, but then it was such a boring PowerPoint that I decided not to. So instead, it's going to be just me reading out my paper. And yeah, apologies for not having anything interesting for you to look at while I'm doing that. Okay, so as Vitor said, my presentation is called Religion and NGO Support in the UK. My name's Moira Dustin, and I'm a researcher on the SOGCA project, which I hope you all know by now is the team that's organising this conference. And this presentation is based on a chapter that I wrote with my colleague Nina Held for a book that's coming out later this year. And the chapter is called They Sent Me to the Mountain, The Role of Space, Religion and Support Groups for LGBTIQ+ Asylum Claimants. And the book's called Queer Migration and Asylum in Europe, and it's edited by Richard Mole at UCL. And it's coming out, it's published by UCL Press. And both that chapter and this presentation are based on the SOGCA project fieldwork, specifically the interviews and focus groups that we conducted in Germany, Italy, and the UK. And a point of clarification, I'll be using both the terms LGBTIQ+ and SOGI, meaning sexual orientation and gender identity here. And I'll also be using pseudonyms for everyone, not people's real names. They're pseudonyms that were chosen by our fieldwork participants when we asked them how they wanted to be described. So there's a growing body of literature addressing the SOGI asylum legal process in Europe and European countries. What's less explored is the social dimension, which we define broadly to mean the experiences outside the legal process of LGBTIQ+ people seeking asylum. And that's experiences including and relating to religion and religious belief, which is the focus of this presentation. And my argument is that the legal asylum process does not operate in isolation from social phenomena such as religion, that there are pathways of influence and causality that make a difference not only to the physical and mental well-being of SOGI minorities claiming asylum, but also to the legal outcomes of their cases, as I'm going to discuss. And SOGI persecution is often legitimised on religious grounds, as I think we're probably all aware. And this is something that's formally recognised in UNHCR guidance, as well as by national authorities. And as expected, religion featured regularly in the accounts of the SOGICA project participants, both as one of the ways they identified themselves and as a factor in their persecution. So of the 64 asylum claimants or refugees that were individually interviewed for the SOGICA project, 36 identified as some kind of either Muslim or Christian or Jewish. The others identified as atheist, agnostic, humanist, or didn't specify. And a number of participants explained how religion contributed to their reasons for fleeing their families and communities. So Megs, a UK participant, told us, because we are Christians, Zimbabwe is a very Christian country, so homosexuality is just a sin, and I grew up knowing that from the word go. Similarly, in Italy, Momo, claiming asylum there, had been told that when his country of origin, had been told that he wouldn't be given a funeral when he died. Because you're gay, you're not worthy, you're not a Muslim. Siri, who was also claiming asylum in Italy, came from a Muslim family and had wanted to tell his father he was gay, but his mother told him not to. She said, no, if you talk to him, he'll kill you. And Siri left home the same day of this conversation. But despite that, of the 5 refugee convention grounds that are the basis for asylum claims, SOGI claims are rarely granted or analysed using the category of religion. They tend to rely on the more encompassing, looser category of particular social group. So the focus thus becomes the identity or behaviour of the claimant and not the legitimating factors of the persecutor. And the default deployment of the particular social group category for SOGI claims has been criticised, and it's been argued that decision makers should make better use of the category of religion for sexual orientation claims. But this hasn't happened. Rather, as Vitor in his introduction indicated, we see religious affiliation or a religious upbringing deployed against the claimant. The belief on the part of decision makers, both in the first instance and on appeal in the countries that we looked at, which is Germany, Italy and the UK, is often a very simplistic one, that sexual and gender non-conformity are condemned in conservative interpretations of the major world religions, and therefore, to be recognised as genuine, claimants must either renounce their faith or they have to show that they struggle to reconcile it with their sexuality or gender identity. So to give you an example, Jane in the UK was asked how she reconciled her religion with her sexuality. But the Home Office didn't find her response, which was, yes, I'm a Catholic and I'm a lesbian by sexual orientation, and I don't need to reconcile anything with anything there. That's a quote from Jane. They didn't find that convincing, and her initial application was refused. And she had a terrible struggle that lasted years and went to appeal to finally get recognition, which thankfully she now has. But this line of argument breaches Home Office guidance, which states that a claimant's religion is not a basis for rejecting their claim. LGB individuals may be adherents of religions that disapprove of homosexuality or preach against it or indeed forbid it. But Jane's experience was not an isolated incident. And we had that confirmed by a solicitor with a firm that specialises in SOGI claims. And she said that this is a very common approach. She said, I have seen a lot of questions about Muslim clients in particular, about how they lived, the fact that Islam is against it if they're religious. So they, meaning the Home Office representative, would often ask, you're religious, are you practicing? And if the answer is positive, then the Home Office asks, how does that fit with your sexual identity? And we saw one claimant's refusal documents that included precisely this kind of argument. And I'm going to quote from a refusal letter from the Home Office here of July 2018. The letter said, you claim you're a practicing Christian. However, staying in Malawi, what they mean is living in Malawi, it does not seem that you have had any internal conflict with the views of Christianity on homosexuality. You state that you went to church and ignored what the Bible said about homosexuality, and that you felt normal and okay with this. Given that you're a practicing Christian, your failure to raise any potential conflict in relation to your behaviour and belief raises doubts regarding your credibility. And in Italy, there's evidence of a similar approach where Antonella, who's a volunteer with an LGBTIQ+ organisation, told us that a question that the Territorial Commission can ask, the Territorial Commission is the decision-making body on asylum applications in Italy. A question that they can ask is, how is it that you as a believer still manage to be homosexual even if you are a believer? And Antonella said that that kind of question was very often asked. So as these examples show, official lines of argument are often really unsophisticated. Homosexuality is perceived by decision makers, and I'm using homosexuality in inverted commas, corresponding to the language of much official literature still, is perceived by decision makers as strictly forbidden by Christianity, African Christianity in particular, and by Islam, the most common faith of Asian and Middle Eastern asylum claimants. So claimants must therefore demonstrate that they have renounced or at least had a terrible internal struggle with their faith. And this approach is the basis for undermining LGBTIQ+ claimants' credibility appears to be common. However, as an explanation of the relationship between sexuality and religion in the context of asylum, it's very inadequate. The reality of individual religiosity is far more complex, and claimants explained their faith to us in a variety of ways. So we heard from some people who rejected organised religion altogether while continuing to believe in God, like Michael, who said, I do believe God is there, I believe in the power, and yes, I believe in God, but I don't want anything in between. And by anything in between, he meant any kind of organised religious body. Similarly, Diamond in the UK stated, yes, I'm religious because there is no book of Hindu religions, in Diamond's case, that has written that gay is a sin. Or, as Mamaka in Italy told us, I pray my 5 daily prayers. Because I'm a lesbian doesn't mean I should leave my religion. So for all these individuals, the fact that their persecution had been legitimated on religious grounds didn't mean that they were willing or wanted to walk away from their faith. So persecution that's justified on religious grounds may be one of the reasons individuals flee their country of origin. However, such discrimination is also prevalent in Europe, in the countries where they're claiming asylum. It occurs in mainstream religious institutions and organisations, as well as in diaspora community organisations and networks supporting asylum claimants. And that experience or fear of exclusion and hostility may have an impact for people preparing their asylum case. So fearing the continuation of the discrimination they experience at home, newly arrived asylum claimants needing practical and emotional support from refugee and migrant organisations or from NGOs supporting refugees and migrants, they may find it expedient to keep their sexuality concealed. But then continuing to conceal their sexuality makes a successful application far less likely. So Patty, who we talked to in the UK, told us that she loves going to church and singing in the chapel there, but she also spoke about how church members preached against gays and lesbians. And she said, so I couldn't tell anyone, even my roommate didn't know about it. I always hid my papers, all the papers, I just hid them. I didn't want anyone to know about them. I didn't want people pointing at me and talking about me. So then when immigration came, they say, oh, they don't believe me. No one knows about me. Why am I not open about it? Well, I'm not going to go around and start telling people I'm this, I'm this, I'm this. I'm not going to. At the end of the day, I'm in a Black community where people don't like it. So you could describe this as a chill factor, where the knowledge that many people interpret their faith in ways that are hostile to Soji minorities prevents people, particularly new arrivals who haven't got much in the way of support and resources, from being open about their sexual identity or gender identity. So they then find it difficult to prove their LGBTIQ+ to decision makers because they lack evidence. What's interesting is that despite all these negative experiences, many people retain very strong religious affiliations, as shown by the statistics that I cited at the start of my presentation. So while some people's experiences had led them to develop a personal approach to religion that was unmediated by religious organisations, others had instead sought out LGBTIQ+ friendly churches. So in this way, religion can also be a significant source of support. And such non-discriminatory and identity-affirming religious organisations, as well as LGBTIQ+ groups that have been established by asylum claimants and refugees themselves with a religious ethos, provide a lot of practical support, and I found that particularly in the UK. Support groups with their roots in the Metropolitan Community Church operate in Manchester, Birmingham and other UK cities to provide meeting spaces and resources for LGBTIQ+ claimants. And in fact, a recent report commissioned by the Metropolitan Community Church described how, for many asylum African claimants, finding an accepting church was the beginning of healing. In Manchester, the First Wednesday group, which is a group of upwards of 60 individuals who meet at the LGBT Foundation on the first Wednesday of every month, provides information about the asylum process, refreshments, travel expenses, and networking opportunities. That's obviously all much more, you know, in the context of pre-COVID times when the group would meet physically, but they've now moved online. In Birmingham, Journey Church runs a regular asylum drop-in at the LGBT Centre. And what's important to attendees is the sense of welcome and warmth towards Soji minorities, not necessarily the tenets of a particular religion. So one Muslim man that we talked to attended a presumably Christian or Catholic church, and he said, I'm a Muslim by faith and I practice, and it's really difficult for me to open up with a lot of people within my religion. So I try to join groups. I go to church because they're more welcoming there. So I go to church, and because I believe God is just God with a different name. Faith-based organisations were a source of emotional and psychological support as much as practical. So Megs, who I think I quoted earlier, said, when I'm at church, my spiritual inner woman gets fed because it's something that I was missing back home. I couldn't be a Christian and a gay person. And this was true in other countries we studied. In Italy, one LGBTIQ+ group volunteer described how people who attended their gatherings said that apart from the group, they had nothing but the church. So in conclusion, for many of the claimants who participated in the Sojika project, religion was an important but a very complicated feature of their lives. It was a source of persecution, but also support, sometimes at the same time, and both in the country of origin and the country of claiming asylum. But these complexities were often unrecognised by decision makers who imposed their own, in contrast, very simplistic preconceptions about the relationship between sexual orientation or gender identity and religion. And the negative impact of this for people's claims shows the importance of looking at both the legal and the social experiences of Soji claimants, as these do not exist in isolation from each other. I'm going to stop there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very, very much, Moira, for this very interesting presentation that you have pointed this much more complex picture of religion, both from the part of the asylum system, but also from the participants. So it was quite interesting. Thank you very much. So our second speaker is Claire Fletcher, and her presentation is entitled Religious Experiences During Asylum Seeker in the UK, Reflections from Legal Practitioners. So the floor is yours, Claire. You are muted. No, again.
Oh, here we go.
Now it's working. Go ahead.
Let me just get this up. Is it sharing?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Okay. Okay, well, thanks, Victor, for the introduction, and also thanks, Moira, for your presentation, and also for inviting me to speak at the conference. Just to introduce myself, I've worked and volunteered within the third sector supporting those seeking asylum for about 8 years now. I currently work at the UK Lesbian and Gay Immigration Group as an LGBTQI+ support worker. UK LGIG supports lesbians, gays, bisexual, trans, queer or intersex people through the asylum and immigration system. I'm also currently doing my PhD at UCL and I'm currently in my field research year. Firstly, I want to briefly introduce my research and explain my interest in this topic. I will then move to discuss the early findings of my research and then end with some concluding remarks on how the data could be used. What I would like to present to you here today is some initial findings from my field research. The data I will be discussing was gathered during semi-structured interviews with legal practitioners, including solicitors, barristers, and judges. The aim of the interviews was to explore their experience as legal practitioners, representing claimants and deciding on asylum claims, where the person had both a queer and religious identity. I am interested in how these intersecting identities play out within a person's asylum claim and the impact this can have on their experiences in the UK and outside the legal asylum process. Everything I discuss today is set within the UK context, and I should also mention that my research is qualitative and is not meant to be representative. The findings so far also mainly reflect sexual orientation issues over gender identity within asylum claims, and this is due to the experience of the legal practitioners I've spoken to. All of the asylum claimants referred to in this research are those who are seeking asylum on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. And to refer to the terms, I will refer to SOGI asylum claimants today, but I will also be using the term queer. And while I recognise there are issues about using an umbrella term for the range of LGBTQI+ identities they are, for the sake of ease and everyone having to listen, I will use queer today. Okay, so next I'd like to firstly briefly mention what sparked my interest in starting a research project on this topic. There is a common narrative in the UK and the global north more generally that being both queer and religious is incompatible, as Moira has already previously mentioned. This perception can also be seen in questions queer asylum seekers are asked in asylum interviews and at tribunal hearings and within asylum decisions. However, within my professional life, working as a support worker for queer asylum seekers at UK LGIG, I've had experiences and discussions with clients that contradict this simplistic understanding. Conversations I have paint a more complex picture, and yet there is little reflection of this complexity in asylum decision making. Many of my clients say they still have a religious belief, attend a mainstream religious institution, or attend a queer-friendly religious space. They also talk about religious experiences in both positive and negative ways. This is obviously very different from the simplistic understanding within decision making, and it was this difference that has inspired this research. I will now move to discuss the initial findings from the interviews with legal practitioners. All practitioners noted that the current environment for claiming asylum in the UK is a hostile one, and I think that is the case throughout much of Europe. Within the UK context, asylum claimants experience long delays, and the length of time people have to spend resolving their asylum claim can sometimes take many years. There is also a general culture of disbelief. And also practitioners noted that quite often styles of questioning are combative, especially within the initial asylum claim with the Home Office. Some practitioners did think, however, that this combative style was less so at appeal stage within the first tier tribunal. I will not spend long on this, as I know it's been covered a lot in the conference already, but I also interviewed legal practitioners about the general themes of SOGI asylum claims, and they raised the following themes as being most prevalent within SOGI claims. So they all reference that the need for a clear narrative regarding a person's journey towards their realization of a queer identity, which legal practitioners stated was often not an accurate reflection of their client's experience. If narratives did not match decision maker expectations, then an adverse credibility finding was more common. Decision makers' understanding of queer identities were limited and stereotypical and based on Western understandings of queer identities. Decision makers also seem to use subjective understandings and use own experience when looking at SOGI asylum claims. Practitioners said that claimants who did not have a partner or friends who could provide supporting evidence had a harder time proving their claim. And there was also an expectation from decision makers that the claimant should be living openly in the UK. And if this was not the case, decision makers were more likely to view the client as lying. So moving on. When legal practitioners were asked about their experiences of clients who had both queer and religious identities, the following themes emerged. In terms of the expected narrative, practitioners reported that claimants were expected to provide a clear and sophisticated account of being conflicted between religious and queer identity. One practitioner put it, the most common answer is, God made me like this. You will get some people, maybe 10%, who will have a lovely in-depth explanation about what they are, how they believe, and how they've researched and how they found it difficult. A tiny fraction of people will have lost their faith because of that, and then the rest are just simply unable to articulate, although they may often recognise there is a conflict. Claimants who still had strong religious beliefs and still actively practiced their faith, especially in an institutional setting such as a temple, mosque or church, practitioners reported these claimants received more detailed and invasive questioning about their religious experience. I just want to pause here and show you this slide. This slide shows the top 5 nationalities where the highest proportion of asylum applications where sexual orientation formed the basis of their claim in 2018. It should be noticed, this is experimental statistics from the Home Office, and it only looks at lesbian, gay and bisexual identities. And as you can see, those countries are first Uganda, Malaysia, Cameroon, Pakistan and Bangladesh. It should be noted that the statistics, that all of these countries have very strong religious affiliation. Taking research done by the Pew and Templeton Global Religious Futures Project, looking at each of these countries, participants were asked about how important religion was in their day-to-day lives. And you can see the percentages next to each of the country. For example, in Pakistan, 94% of people answered that religion was very important within their day-to-day life. Okay. This is quite a basic illustration perhaps, but it does illustrate how the majority of SOGI claimants come from countries where religion is which is a very important factor in life. Okay, returning to the issues raised. Legal practitioners report that questioning is grounded heavily in theology when a claimant expresses both a religious and queer identity. There is an expectation that individuals will have a detailed understanding of their religion and scripture, and practitioners noted that in their experience, this is rarely the case. When expressing a religious and queer identity, decision makers seem to disbelieve claimants more if they were one religion over the other. Islam was mentioned most frequently by legal practitioners in terms of decision makers finding claimants' account not credible if they claim to be both Muslim and queer. Legal decision makers did note that decisions were better on the whole, but they still thought that they were based on stereotypical understandings and were subjective in nature, and are still very much an issue in SOGI identity claims. So, going back to the core themes of the initial findings. The issue of being visible and out in the UK was a core theme within the interviews with legal practitioners. And as noted earlier, there is an expectation by decision makers that a queer person who has fled their country of origin due to persecution of being queer will live openly once they arrive in the UK. And as Moira has already pointed out, this is not the case for a number of reasons. This expectation not only has implications within a person's asylum claim, but also on their social life within the UK and the support structures that they have available to them. I asked legal practitioners about the experiences of their SOGI clients who had religious identities and why they would continue to live privately once they arrived in the UK. The most common reasons raised were they were fearful that the community who was supporting them would reject them if they found out that they were queer. Often claimants were receiving support from churches, mosques or temples, and there was a real or imagined fear that this support would stop. And the types of support that these communities were providing to claimants ranged from paying for legal representation, providing food and accommodation, emotional and material support. Practitioners noted that clients had to make hard choices about whether to live openly and therefore more likely to be believed within their asylum claim, or losing support that, within the UK. One practitioner sums this up when they said, "You might have friends and your only friends are homophobic or transphobic, and you have to make some hard choices in the knowledge of the consequences." The consequences of losing this support meant that most clients who had a queer identity had their support discontinued, and this leaves them at greater risk of destitution and exploitative situations. This can include exchanging sex for accommodation or taking on work for accommodation and food, and this often includes long hours and in very bad conditions. This is also should be noted that this is due that quite often queer asylum seekers fear accessing mainstream asylum support, and this can be subsistence support and or accommodation. As most of you know, in the UK, and I'm sure it is in the rest of Europe, the support is very low and accommodation is on a no choice basis and often outside of London. And clients fear that if they go into this support, that they will be away from queer support networks, they will experience harassment and violence within NAS accommodation because you will have to share a room. And so therefore, a lot of them will choose to be homeless or live in insecure and exploitative situations rather than take up the support. Okay. Other issues that legal practitioners raised, that clients have been pressured into conversion therapy when their SOGI identity was revealed and discovered. Another practitioner reported that a client attended one church but discovered this church had homophobic beliefs. The client left but did not reject their faith, but looked for a queer affirming church where they were happy to continue to practice. Other practitioners had examples of queer asylum claimants who had been disowned by one religious community only to be taken in and supported by another. So in my concluding remarks, as can be seen by these early findings from legal practitioners and their reflections on the client's experiences, they are far from simplistic. Legal practitioners noted that asylum policy instructions on sexual orientation in asylum were pretty good, but thought that further training is needed as the API guidance is not being seen within decision making. Also, this in terms of what the third sector can do, quite often queer asylum seekers fear approaching services because they think that refugee services that are available may also have homophobic beliefs and therefore are less likely to approach services when they are destitute and need support. I would like to end on a story of how these findings are reflected in reality. I should note that this story is a composite of experience of clients, but I thought it illustrates how issues of not being visible and how people find it difficulty in accessing support. So this gay male client was discovered having sex with his boyfriend by his family, and he was beaten and tortured by his community. He managed to escape, but members of his community tracked him down and set fire to his home. He luckily survived, and a female relative paid for him to arrive in the UK. However, on arrival, the agent who brought him to the UK stole his documentation. After one night in a hostel, he was street homeless. He had no idea he could claim on the basis of SOGI, and he therefore was street homeless for 8 months until he started attending a church. Over a period of weeks, the congregation got to know of his situation as being homeless and not having any status in the UK. Here, they let him sleep on various sofas, they provided him with financial support, and they also recommended that he claim asylum. However, he was not open about his sexuality for fear of the support being discontinued. He was also fearful of engaging in relationships with other people, and he had no friends or a partner due to trauma back home. So that just gives you a nice illustration of the variety of issues that people can face on arrival. Thank you very much for listening, and I'd welcome any feedback or questions.
Thank you very, very much, Claire, for your fascinating presentation. I found it very interesting that you put some figures, some percentage of the countries of origin, because then it's easier for us to understand how religion is really important in that context. And of course, people move to the UK, but they are not, like the religion comes with them. So it's a very important point that you make. Also, I really enjoyed how you have mentioned the Western understandings, as Moira did as well, and the articulation that you showed us about sexual orientation with the nationality, with people from the same country of origin, with religion, and with accommodation or lack of accommodation in the case of homeless and destitution. So thank you very much. And now our third speaker is Ernesto Fiocchetto, and his presentation is entitled The Role of Religion for Identity and Integration of LGBTIQ+ asylum seekers and refugees in Germany. So please, Ernesto. I guess you are now it's working. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I will try to share my okay. Can you see my presentation? Yes, great. Thank you very much.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Okay. My name is Ernesto Fiocchetto. I'm from Argentina. I'm a sociologist, and I moved in Florida, United States, some years ago, and did my master's in religious studies, and now I'm a PhD student at Florida International University. I'm doing the PhD in international relations, and my dissertation will address the multidimensional intersection between transnational mobility, forced migration, religious identities, and sovereignty. The focus of this presentation is on faith actors. I use this terminology, faith actors, and I define faith actors as agreed during the 2012 UNHCR Dialogue on Faith and Protection. It is an umbrella term that includes faith-based organizations, local faith communities, faith leaders, and that vary in size from a group composed of a few believers to global religions and broad interfaith networks. And I also should say that this presentation, for this presentation, I used some ethnographic data from semi-structures interviews conducted between November 2018 and March 2019 with both LGBTIQ+ asylum seekers and refugees in different cities in Germany from the MENA region. By MENA, I mean Middle East and North Africa region. And also from faith actors and people who work, for example, in faith-based organizations. But I also use public debate, policy reports, and legal documents that are available. Between 2015 and 2019, nearly 1.8 million refugees have been registered in Germany. According to the Lesbian and Gay Federation in Germany, out of these 1.8 refugees, approximately 67,000 are LGBTIQ+ individuals from countries in the Middle East and North Africa region, principally Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, and Algeria. Exact numbers of LGBTIQ+ refugees and asylum seekers in Germany, however, are difficult to obtain because the Federal Office of Migration and Refugees does not separately register LGBTIQ+ asylum cases. In addition, there are also many asylum seekers who happen to be LGBTIQ+, but who are not claiming asylum principally on the basis of their sojourn. Most LGBTIQ+ refugees from Muslim majoritarian countries who have arrived in Germany since 2015 have not only fled cruel wars, but also severe human rights violations in their countries of origin due to their sexual orientation and/or gender identity. We all know that many countries' laws stipulate severe criminal convictions for freedom of expression for LGBTIQ+ people. This is to engage, for example, in same-sex conduct in public and in private. Besides these legal restrictions, same-sex conduct and non-gender conform behavior is further curtailed by social stigmatization. Religion plays a crucial role in such stigmatization. Of course, because of some mainstream currents within Islam. However, the background of many of the legal and social restrictions have also another background. Most of the MENA region countries that criminalize LGBTIQ+ people's desires, bodies, speech, and movements inherited this legislation from the French, Portuguese, and British colonial justice system. These empires drafted those anti-LGBT laws with the intention to moralize the colonies and to Christianize local communities. For instance, the strict anti-LGBT laws that exist today in the MENA region are by no means just colonial relicts, but an integral part of contemporary politics around nationalism and cultural authenticity gathered toward establishing moral and political autonomy from the West. The management of sex becomes a tool of governance that produces individual and freedom in the name of expanding national freedom and independence. In the German migration context, the circulation of images that depict the human rights abuse of gay and non-gender conform individuals that are executed, for example in Iran, beaten up and subjected to corrective rape in Uganda or Nigeria, and thrown off buildings in Syria and Iraq through national and social media since 2011, tend to be referenced against the background of the expanding LGBTIQ+ rights frameworks within the European Union. Jasbir Puar eloquently argues that the sexual masculine subject is constitutive of the fantasy of the Western queer liberalism. The rise of homonationalism in the West implies that the LGBT, no Q and I, friendly nation state with the acceptance and tolerance for gay and lesbian subjects is constituted by ideas around the homophobic other. Such rhetoric that establishes cultural hierarchies based on queer liberalisms, as Paul terms it, has also the currency in the German asylum context. Over the last decades, Germany has followed the LGBT liberal course of the European Union by increasing the adoption rights of LGBT, not generally IQ and plus people. A Pew Research study shows that Germany is seen as one of the most gay-friendly countries in the world, with over 80% of its people supporting homosexuality, not necessarily queerness and transsexuality, and the full inclusion of gay and lesbians within Germany's family law. However, it is important to note that the conformism of LGBT rights with heteronormative neoliberal family values, what we can name new homonormativity, often excludes gender non-conform individuals and leaves inequalities along the lines of race, class, ethnicity, health, disability, and immigration status unquestioned. In a few words, the real beneficiaries of LGBTIQ+ liberal laws and policies in Germany are those within the homo norm: white homosexual, bisexual men and women with a middle-class background. Gay folks of color, trans or non-gender binary people, and especially those with uncertain legal status in Germany, in contrast, do not profit the same extent for gay-friendly legislation and attitudes. In fact, for the most part, their experiences with racism and homophobia are erased, especially in the asylum context. Religion in general and faith actors supporting refugees in particular play their roles in such a complicated context. In my ongoing research project, I claim that on the one hand, religions, not only Islam, play a contributing role regarding the anti-LGBTIQ+ laws that exist today in the MENA region. But on the other hand, religion plays intersecting roles during the reception process in the host countries, particularly in Germany, through faith actors, official churches, faith-based organizations, religious leaders, and religious communities. The latter role of religion is examined in this presentation. In my research, I'm constructing a threefold typology to better understand the aforementioned intersecting roles of religion and faith actors during the reception process of LGBTIQ+ asylum seekers and refugees, and how they influence claimants' identity and integration in the host society and community of fellow national ethnic groups. It's worth noting that, of course, these three types that I'm going to present now coexist within the same faith actors. This is not a classification of actors, but a way to understand the polyvalent roles that faith actors play. First, faith actors are beneficial for the integration of LGBTIQ+ in host societies and articulate their mission with the German legal system. In such articulation, faith actor challenges both the legal system and their own religious dogmas in order to, or in favor of the refugees. Let's see an example of the action of faith actors and how they challenge the legal system, without consequences. The German government decides who receives asylum and, in special cases, allows faith actors to grant sanctuary temporarily. In fact, for rejected asylum seekers in Germany, turning to the churches, for example, is often their last hope. Many organizations open their doors to delay or prevent an imminent deportation. The refugees then live for several weeks or months on the congregation's premises, which gives them temporary protection from police access. Thus, faith actors, through what we call church asylum, makes it possible to submit individual cases to the authorities for re-examination and thus prevent humanitarian hardship. The issue of church asylum requires a good deal of tact, as it is a great area where law, humanitarianism, and national politics intersect. According to a report of the DPA, the German news agency, church parishes disregarded procedural rules in roughly 50% of the cases they saw between early 2017 and the end of June 2018. The figures were provided to DPA by the Federal Office of Migration and Refugees. Of course, such a challenge to the legal system has consequences. The Federal Office for Migration and Refugees accepted only 2 out of 147 church asylum cases through January to April 2019. Overall, there were 250 reported cases of church asylum in the first 4 months of 2019, compared with 1,520 for the same period the previous year. Between 2015 and 2016, the agency had recognized up to 80% of the cases presented by the churches. While faith actors are ready to challenge the German legal system in favor of refugees, they are also ready to challenge or accommodate their own system of belief in favor of LGBTIQ+ refugees. In fact, many LGBTIQ+ refugees find warming community niches within faith actors. I will read 2 very small phrases from the interviews. One of the actors within an organization said, "We don't judge the person, we just help men and women because they are sons of God." And a trans woman said, "He," speaking of the pastor, "invited me to the service. I told him that I didn't want him to get in trouble because of me, and he told me, beyond our loss, you are a child of God. Jesus loves you. He will be very happy to have you in our church." I'm running out of time, so I try to be very brief with the other 2 characteristics. The second one is that faith actors reproduce the religious heteronormativity from the refugees' countries of origin. Even when the process of asylum claims is positive and the individual receives the approval of the refugee status, the religious issues remain active. For example, in conservative Islam communities, persecution and violence in shelter houses are very common. And there is a problem of conversion when the Christian faith organizations plays a role. No, they try to convert Muslim people to Christianity. At the first step, they don't pay attention, they are shoji, but then they start to make pressure to accommodate to the Christian ethics. And the third characteristic is faith actors also embody the German homonormative idealization of queer identities through institutional expectations around sex, gender, and sexuality. The manner in which the idealization of the good gay Muslim asylum seeker confirm current immigration tendencies, as I described before, also shape the religious expectations and possibilities of the LGBTIQ+ asylum and refugee seeker. Asylum applicants with Muslim backgrounds seek protection by a hegemonic Western heteronormative framework of sexuality and desire that is reproduced in religious community. The fantasy of the queer liberalism, homo-nationalism, the image of the friendly nation state, the friendly church, the friendly mosque, the new homonormativity are also working in the background of faith actors. In conclusion, from the multidimensional intersection between transnational mobility, forced migration, religion, and LGBTIQ+ identities, we can say that religion both allows and constrains the process of identity configuration and integration in the host societies. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ernesto, very, very much for this wonderful presentation. I really appreciated that you have mentioned the colonial heritage and how it plays an important role with this narrative of queer liberalism, like with this fantasy, because normally I don't think, like, it's difficult to generalize, but normally it's not something that people from the global north mention. Like most researchers, they don't point specifically about the colonial picture in this context. So thank you very much for bringing that.